Welcome to the Lorne panel.
Hello, is this on?
I'm Laraine Newman. This, of course, is the author, Susan Morrison. I don't think you need to know our bona fides, but I could tell you anyway. I'm a founding member of the Groundlings, original cast member of SNL. I'm on the board of San Francisco Sketch Fest, now in its 22nd year, and I do stupid voices for money. Susan, the New Yorker and Spy alone, that's just, who could top that?
Well, maybe the book tops that. No, I'm an editor at The New Yorker. I've been there for about 30 years. Before that, I helped start Spy magazine, and I've been working on this book for 10 years. And I'm just I can't tell you how exciting it is to be here with Laraine, who is really, one of the framers of SNL's Constitution. I mean, it really is remarkable, so I'm so pleased.
Well, I just want to say how wonderfully you structured this book. It's kind of a thrill ride in the sense that it goes Monday, and then you meet the host for that week. It is just 1 week in, of the years and years, and the host is Jonah Hill. And it's basically, the things that happen during the week of him having to deal with Jonah Hill and 50,000 other things. But what's great is that we start with that Monday and then we go back.
Right. When I was working on the first few years when I was working on the book, I realized, even though I had never written a biography before, I realized that one of the hazards of a biography is that you get into a thing where it's kind of a death march through the years, and especially with a subject like SNL, which is broken into annual seasons. I wanted to avoid that plodding quality, and I realized also as a magazine journalist, I wanted readers to have that kind of in-the-room feeling of what it's like to actually be there when this crazy thing is being done. So I kind of embedded at the show for a whole week. Poor Lorne allowed me to basically be at his elbow for a week. And I wrote 6 different chapters about each day of the week, because each day of the week there is completely different. And by Wednesday, it really starts to become like the Hunger Games. It gets, the stress ratchets up. And that allowed me to introduce readers to modern-day Lorne in the beginning. And it also meant that you didn't really have to start the book in, 1944 Toronto, which is not really that swinging a place, So.
But we do get to understand, the things that, impacted him emotionally, that informed a lot of his style as a producer later on. And what's great is that we see a lot of the things that Lorne did that helped him to not only know what he didn't want to see on TV, but what he did want to see on TV. And each successive, failure, disappointment, always led to another job and another lesson on what he wanted to do.
Yeah, I found that I was most intrigued reporting on the part of Lorne's life before SNL. Because, once your character walks onto the world stage, they're kind of covered by the media. And it was all that other stuff that made him what he became that was, no one knew it. So it was all virgin territory. And I found, to my surprise, that he really was like a character out of Dickens or something, and that every single thing that he did along the way, it was like ding, and taught him an important lesson. And, there's a lot of people always say, like, what is it that a producer does? It's kind of a hard question to answer. In fact, there's a part in my book where Lorne wins the Kennedy Center honor, and Steve Martin comes on stage and does this funny bit where he says, people are always asking me what a producer does. And then he gestures up to Lorne sitting in the presidential box next to President Biden, just sitting there. And he goes, that, ladies and gentlemen, is what a producer does. But in fact, it's a million little things, little issues of taste and timing and framing and costumes and getting the most out of people, figuring out how to squeeze talent out of people. And just one example I'll give about these early shows. Lorne came to Hollywood. He arrived here the week Bobby Kennedy was shot which was all kind of a, made it harder for him to get his bearings. It wasn't, made Hollywood feel less glamorous. But one of his early jobs was working at Laugh-In, which was a hit show, but he took no pleasure in it. And that's because the producer, George Schlatter, had it set up so that the whole writing staff worked out of a motel miles from the Burbank studio. So they're in this kind of, little motel room all together, spitballing jokes, coming up with things, and just turning them over to some head writer who would then take them back to his office, rewrite them, maybe rewrite them again. And as a writer, you had absolutely no contact with the talent, with the director. You were never on the set. And Lorne said that they would watch the show in the hotel room on Monday and maybe see glimmers of their jokes on the air. So you had no sense of ownership or pride, or you had no investment in it. This is such a good, I think, management lesson across the board. When I was writing this book, I feel like, because I'm a magazine editor, I picked up so many pointers from Lorne about how to manage creative people. But the direct upshot of that traumatic Laugh-In experience is that when Lorne started SNL, he specifically decided that he wanted to elevate the writers and make them the most important.
The radical idea.
Make them the most important part of the show. And, he took months hiring the initial writing staff. And he actually hired you guys a little bit more quickly. The writing...
Well, he hired Garrett as a writer.
Right.
And Chevy as a writer.
That's right.
And I think the actors that were cast were me, Gilda, and Danny.
Right. And then there were auditions.
And then we watched auditions, and we watched Jane's audition. I don't know that we saw anybody else's audition.
Yeah. No, so he lavished all this time on the writers, and still to this day, one of the things that's very strange about the way SNL is done is a writer writes a sketch, say after this, then on Wednesday there's a 4-hour read-through, and if one of those sketches is chosen to be put into production for the show, the writer will have complete responsibility for producing it. He or she will determine the costumes, work with the set designers, direct it, pick the camera shots, the blocking, and I think Lorne's idea is that makes it better because it makes them really care about it. There are others who say it gives him deniability if the thing's a flop, but it does get people to take responsibility for their work. And I think it's one of the main reasons why SNL produces so many other showrunners and producers and directors. People leave that show and they're fully equipped to know how to run something.
Well, also, he also wrote for the beautiful Phyllis Diller show. And you write about him saying that we were told to write 50, pardon me for using this word, but this is what was said to him, fag jokes and 50 mother-in-law jokes. And they were on opposite Barbra Streisand's concert, and he thought, well, we're dead. Turns out her show did a 19 share and Phyllis Diller's did a 34 share. And so, I look at that, and he must have looked at that, and then you look on later on and you hear him, talking to Jonah Hill saying, we want all 50 states to like this sketch.
Yeah, the lesson, he was so shocked when Phyllis Diller did better than Barbra Streisand, because as he said, this was when Barbra Streisand was starring in Funny Girl. She was the hottest thing out there. And he said, oh my God, that's when I realized there are two Americas. There's another America. It's not just coastal people like me who would want to watch Barbra Streisand. And that's also a really important lesson. And today, as Laraine said, he's always telling his writers, we're on in all 50 states, and you have to cater to that audience.
And it's a struggle because it is an alternative comedy show. That's what I think distinguishes it. This occurred to me a while ago because, this idea of alt comedy, that was really what we were, as opposed to something like Laugh-In or Carol Burnett, wonderful shows. different group of people writing it and thinking of it.
Right. When Lorne was pitching his show, he tried getting SNL off the ground for years before anything happened. And the way he described it to executives is that he wanted new wine in old bottles. And what he meant by that is he liked the basic variety format, which is it goes back to vaudeville. You have some music, you have some comedy. They maybe had some elephant acts, which SNL doesn't have, but, acrobats.
They have the llama.
That's right, the llama. But a little bit of everything. But when Lorne was a man in his 20s working on these shows in L.A., he felt that, TV, the content of it, was lagging so far behind the rest of the culture. In the movies, you had Scorsese and Terrence Malick and Robert Altman, and in music, you had the Rolling Stones and David Bowie. But TV, it felt like it was from the 50s. And one of the things that he told me that I just think is so telling. He bonded with Lily Tomlin, who would become a partner of his, because they both noticed that if you watched a Bob Hope special and the characters were supposed to be stoned, they just acted drunk because they didn't know what stoned was, So, and his idea was to try to take the same format as Carol Burnett and all these others, but update the content. So it wasn't about sketches about PTA meetings, and the garage door breaking. It was sketches about sex and drugs and rock and roll and, all those great things that you were so good in.
One of the things that I noticed about Lorne when I first met him, I grew up here in L.A., and I was like across the street from Groucho Marx, down the corner from Kirk Douglas. I'd see Cary Grant at Christmas at shopping at Carroll and Company. So I was not starstruck. And when I met Lorne, I think he was 28, and I noticed that he was. And it always bothered me because I thought, you're just as good as they are, But what I noticed, he made a lot of contacts when he was here in L.A. He met Bernie Brillstein, also Bob Schiller, who was an I Love Lucy writer, and whose son Tom became a writer on our show, and one of those people that, gave a shade of color to our show that, everybody offered a different thing to that collage of our content. But he also befriended Paul Simon and Randy Newman. And you write where he internalized his fandom, making friendship, well, you didn't say this, but making friendship a kind of currency.
Yeah, for a furrier son from Canada, he had this enormous facility with befriending really famous people. And his first wife, who was also a writer on the show and a friend of Lorraine's, Rosie Schuster, who he met in his neighborhood as a kid in Toronto, his father was half of a very famous Canadian comedy duo called Wayne and Schuster.
Her father,
Anyone here ever heard of Wayne and Schuster? Well, they were the most frequently booked act on the Ed Sullivan Show, which is kind of amazing. But so Frank Schuster was a huge star, and Lorne, who had lost his own father, kind of basically moved into the Schuster's house and made Frank Schuster his surrogate dad. And Rosie, observing him up close, said from a really early age he had this way of, he was never the kind of fan who wanted an autograph. To use a favorite word of Lorne's, he was never sweaty about it. He would have been really cool, metabolized his fandom in such a way just to sort of engage with the work. And later when he, started encountering lots of real famous people, I think there's a phrase I use in the book that, he was able to befriend people who didn't necessarily need new friends, Mick Jagger and it's something I think he also picked up some of this from Mike Nichols, who was also an immigrant who changed his name. Lorne was born Lorne Lipowitz, but they both kind of had this way of moving through New York society and famous people in this very low-key way. And, I use the phrase the friendship economy in the book. They both really learned how to work that. Mm-hmm. And I don't mean that in a sinister way, but it's just, they learn how to do that. But there's a kind of a funny flip side about that, because as Laraine said, Lorne loves celebrities. He's a little starstruck. And even now, 80 years old, a mogul with millions of fancy friends, he's not at all embarrassed to let you know how much
teasing.
He loves these celebrity friends. Like I was kind of charmed the day he told me that he saves all of his voicemails from Paul McCartney. I just thought, I was sort of surprised that a guy like him would do that. And then, but there's also a great story in the book that one of his people told me about being at Yankee Stadium with Lorne, and he has these box seats behind home plate, and he always brings a bunch of people. And this one day, there was someone there who was thinking of doing some kind of business deal with Lorne. And after a couple of innings of hearing Lorne say, well, Mick was here last week, and this is where Jack likes to sit. And the guy, made a gently mocking remark, and he said, like, gee, do you only know famous people? And Lorne just kind of looked at him, and he goes, well, I know you.
Very nice. Going back to a historical event, a traumatic event for him, which was the death of his father. And I think, Billy Crystal had the same thing happen, where he had an argument with his dad, and then the dad went away and something happened and they died. And you say that it made him non-confrontational. And I think that really did affect his producing style. It was an aspect of him never wanting to fire anybody. And I remember him telling me very early on, he never wanted to be anyone that brought bad news. Didn't want it to come from him. But, I'm so surprised by how much of himself he revealed to you. And was he ever, cognizant of this aspect of not wanting to be confrontational, and how do you think it might have affected his producing style?
It's interesting. He, when I decided to write this book 10 years ago, it was after the 40th anniversary, and I was really struck just looking back, thinking about how, strange it is that this one person, especially a Canadian, had so much control over what generations of Americans think is funny, what we all laugh at. And I also knew that he didn't, had made a habit of not really talking to reporters very much. And he seemed like he was hiding in plain sight, So, I will cut through the part where I somehow managed to get him to talk to me. But he did. And I think I just got him when he was starting to think about his legacy. And we had a great rapport. And, I interviewed him over 10 years, probably about 50 times. So I think he just got very comfortable. And it's interesting because he's a big fan of psychoanalysis and psychotherapy. He's always recommending it to people and talking about his shrinks and everything. But he doesn't talk in an interior way. He doesn't talk in an introspective way. But it's more, he gave me a lot of the puzzle pieces, and then I would ask him and we would sort of put them together. But in terms of his father's death, yes, he and his father had a huge argument. His father collapsed, then was taken to the hospital, and Lorne never saw him again. And I think he told me that he carried around, this is actually maybe one of the most purely psychological things he ever said to me. He said that he carried this guilt around for decades, that it was his fault, until he had his own children, and once his first son was born, he had this, it's corny, but I think anyone who's a parent understands this, had such a sense of what this unconditional love is that you just knew that, of course, his father loved him.
His father would forgive him, of course.
Yeah, and I think that actually marked a sort of change in his producing style a little bit in the 90s. But in terms of how the dad thing influenced how he worked, his whole life he has had, I guess it's hard to do it now, but he's always sought out father figures. And then he also was a father figure. So he had a lot of his own, and then he naturally kind of became one. And the ones who are crankier about him will say that he was enacting a kind of transference. He would make you think he was your father, and rely on him and project all these things, and then he would withhold his love.
Well, also, I think in the beginning, when I don't think he quite understood how to walk a line between friendship and producing. And, I think that it took him a while to get used to his position as an administrator.
Yes, and especially with your group. I think in the beginning, he was the same age as all of you. And trying to be your manager and your pal must have been difficult. How did you experience that? Could you tell that's what was happening?
Well, yeah, we were friends. I mean, we were friends in L.A. for a long time after I did the Lily Tomlin special with him. And, we'd go places together. And another thing that, I tell this story in my memoir that showed his heart. This was in the early 70s before SNL, and his marriage with Rosie was breaking up. And he was staying at the Chateau Marmont in a small room with a hot plate and popcorn. That's what he lived on, and still does. And there was I don't know what you would call him, the fitness guy, who literally, I never knew he looked like, but if I could imagine him, he looked like a witch. And, this was the night of switchboards to me. And he would, and one time I was walking through the lobby and just, so despondent. And he sees this guy, and the switchboard is lit up in the guy's wedding book. And Lorne says, those calls could be for me, and I just was like, I had never, up until that point, not seen that side of him. And so, when we started doing the show, I still kind of had that kind of connection, but as his responsibilities and the demands on him became, just exploded and refracted in ways that I don't think he could ever have imagined, although God knows he rose to the occasion. Right. He couldn't be that.
Yeah, he told me that after the first 5 years, he learned that he had to put up boundaries, real boundaries. John Belushi would show up in his lobby at 3:30, asking if he could sleep over, and I think once he lit the mattress on fire, But the other thing is that another big change in terms of how he thought about management is in the first 5 years, nobody knew in the 70s that SNL was going to be this thing that it has become. And the cast, he told me originally, it was never the plan that the cast would become famous. You'd have the hosts and you'd have the musical acts and then you'd have the cast would be doing their parts and everything. But in the first year, Chevy Chase became an enormous star. And partly Lorne realized that was because he was the only person in the cast who every week looked into the camera and said his name. He said, "I'm Chevy Chase and you're not." So people had this identification with him. They knew who he was. You never looked at the camera and said, "I'm Laraine Newman," right? So,
no. I did. I was a reporter. I was a roving reporter. But not enough.
The same, way that Chevy did. And Chevy was on the cover of New York Magazine. He was being called the heir apparent to Johnny Carson. And it created some discord in the cast. Belushi in particular seemed really jealous. And by the end of that year, Chevy Chase was ready to move on. And Lorne and Chevy both talked. This might have been when each of them were the most emotionally raw talking to me. Lorne was devastated. It was almost like his father dying. It was a cataclysm to have this original founding member leave. And then over the next few years, Belushi left, and then Dan Aykroyd left. And that was really hard on him. And so by the time, in the later years of the show, he realized, I have to think about this like a sports franchise. You have to have rookies. You have the older people, and it's always going to be reinventing itself. But it's something he had to learn the hard way. He did not know that.
Mm-hmm. I remember being mad at Chevy for leaving because it was like, this was the first year, and it's like, we're just getting our momentum. We just started to have that notoriety and, getting good reviews finally, and he's going to leave. And I just thought, oh, you fucking dick, why are you doing this, you know?
Did anyone try to talk him out of it?
I don't know. I don't know.
I mean, Buck Henry told me it was so great I got to interview Buck just a couple of years before he died, and he said it was the single stupidest mistake he had ever seen a performer make, because, of course, Chevy had some movies, some big movies, but his career really didn't. It didn't do what I think he thought it was going to do.
Well, he has expressed regret and also felt that it was a stupid thing to do.
Yeah.
And that's a horrible thing to live with,
Right.
It's
right.
like Stuart Sutcliffe. Anybody? No? The guy that left the Beatles before... Oh, thank you.
I have a good friend writing a book about Stu Sutcliffe. Look out for it next year.
Oh,
Because he was
boy.
also a really talented visual artist who gave Lennon and the other Beatles... a real kind of sense of artiness. I mean, it's really key.
He couldn't actually play. That was the problem.
Well, look out for this book by Ted Whitmer.
Oh, details. I didn't know that, yeah. Another thing that I was struck by in the book was Lorne's loyalty. A perfect example is John Head, whom Lorne befriended in Canada, and John was a waiter at a hipster haunt called Nick's Diner. And, I don't know that John ever really kind of landed on any kind of profession, but he was there the first 5 years, and Lorne gave him a job. And, I mean, can you describe what John did on the show? Do you know any idea?
John Head was... somebody
cool,
described
and he was
him to
British.
me as like Lorne's taste guy.
Yes.
Lorne met John when he thought of himself as this kind of bumptious Canadian, and the comedy circles that Lorne moved in Toronto were probably much more, to use that word, sweaty again, kind of loud, catskilly kind of comics. John Head was just the epitome of cool. He was really understated. He always knew where the best restaurants were, what to wear. Somebody used the phrase to me in connection with him, he was an expert vacationer. He just kind of always knew what was cool. And that, I mean, if you want to look for reasons for Lorne's longevity in this business, he's always been obsessed with what's cool. I mean, the idea that even an 80-year-old man still has that, but that is what keeps the show going. And, John Head was the one who taught him the thing of, wear a sports jacket with a pair of jeans. And somebody told me that Lorne's very, very low-key, again, the non-sweaty thing. And in the book I say his speaking voice, he sort of speaks in the tones of a man announcing a golf tournament. It's very... But someone told me that next to John Head, Lorne seemed like a loudmouth, So, but in terms of what he did, he was a part of the talent booking team in the very beginning. But again, my sense of that, I don't think he was scurrying around looking for talent. It was more just thumbs up, thumbs down, not cool enough.
Exactly.
And, in later years, he was just always on the payroll. And just because Lorne was loyal to him, I think, for inculcating him in kind of the world of coolness. When Lorne met, when he roomed with him in Malibu when he first came to L.A. in the early 70s, and John Head was working on a documentary about Jimi Hendrix. He was doing this super cool thing at a time when Lorne was writing the fag jokes that Laraine was talking about. So, yeah, but the other thing about John Head, so he stayed on the payroll. There was a time later when Lorne had this production company called Broadway Video that John Head's job was basically just to sort of approve or veto T-shirt designs, And then
That's
John...
something.
Actually, he died just a couple of years ago. He had hit some really hard times, and Lorne was supporting him to the end. He was paying his rent.
I just found that out from Susan
He
Forstall.
supported him his whole life. And there are a number of other people from those first 5 years who, ended up being drug casualties or whatever, who Lorne continues to support. I mean, that's
Yeah,
nuts.
people don't know that about him, and I'm glad that they can learn that from this book.
But just to add one thing about that, it's he, he has this. He likes Lucky Rabbit's feet, people that he's known, but he also just has a real belief in sticking with the people who were there at the beginning. Bernie Brillstein is agent from the 70s. Probably 15 years in, there wasn't really much more that Bernie actually could do for him, but he never stopped giving him his 15%. He was there at the beginning.
Yeah. His demeanor has always seemed unflappable, but through the book we discover a lot of insecurity and anger and resilience, and his desire for a movie career, the failure of the new show, which was, he left after the first 5 years and he struggled. And, again, because Lorne has such an Oz the Great and Powerful image, you never imagine that he went through this. So there were hard times that I certainly wasn't aware of. And it just, again, I think, he lost money, which I had no idea about. And so that could certainly put him in a position of being sweaty, which I can only imagine is his idea of, the worst horror imaginable.
Yeah, he does it. He earlier in his career, he was a performer in the very beginning, as well as a writer and producer. And he told me, I think we talked about this when I interviewed you.
Yeah, the documentary on him has footage of the Hart and Lorne Terrific Hour.
Oh, yeah.
Can't wait.
Well, you can see that on YouTube. But, everyone should look at that. But he said, when you're a performer, you always have your hat in your hand. Mm-hmm.
Yes.
There's a neediness that you can't escape if you are performing. You need the audience's love, and that was terrifying to him.
Mm-hmm.
But he did get knocked around a lot, and I was talking earlier about how he always seemed to take away a lesson from something. And one lesson that he learned early on and he passes this on to all of his progeny is, when he was working on Laugh-In, the Smothers Brothers show was on CBS, and it was a much cooler show, much hipper show than Laugh-In. At Laugh-In, he wasn't allowed to make fun of Nixon. They could do jokes about the pill, but they couldn't make fun of Watergate or anything. And but the Smothers Brothers, they did a lot of Vietnam material. They had Pete Seeger on singing, Waist Deep in the Big Muddy, and Nixon called Bill Paley, the chairman of CBS, and said, "You got to stop this. This can't go on." I'm sure I'm not the only one who's afraid that something similar could be happening in the next 4 years, but I hope not. But anyway, so the Smothers Brothers were canceled. They were taken off the air, and Lorne learned, his takeaway from that is, yes, that's terrible, but if you get taken off the air, you've got nothing. You've got no platform. You can't do anything. So he never was attracted to this idea that you're going to go to the brink and then be a martyr, because being a martyr, you're done.
No purpose,
you're
really.
done.
Yeah.
And that came back later. I try to do this quickly. I don't know if you guys remember Conan O'Brien's brief stint as the host of The Tonight Show. He was Lorne's discovery. Lorne was in his corner. And there was just a strange scheduling thing that happened, that NBC, Conan was running The Tonight Show, but Jay Leno still wanted to do it. And so NBC came up with this weird compromise where they'd have Jay on for a while, and then they would Conan's Tonight Show on, but starting after midnight. And Conan, who was just a true believer in TV tradition, I don't know if you guys remember this, but he went to the brink. He basically became a martyr. He said he couldn't do that to The Tonight Show, and to change the timing of it, the sacrosanct institution. And the result was he was off the air. Of course, he's landed on his feet, and now he's sold his podcast company for $50 million. And
you're kidding!
He's
it's
doing
a great
great,
podcast.
But that was what Lorne was talking about. It's like, just be a little limber, be a little flexible, stay on the air. So anyway, I lost the thread of the initial question, but
I did
just
too.
getting knocked around.
I forgot what I asked, but I always was like, I marveled at the fact that he took Conan, who was funny in the writer's room, but really I don't know that he performed that much, if at all, on the show.
Right.
And absolutely put, it's like he was all in on Conan.
Yeah.
And, and it was a great instinct. But Lorne certainly didn't really have any proof that he would succeed. But and the network was breathing down his neck to cancel it and to make all sorts of changes. And Lorne just stayed the course, and it paid off. And I was marveled at his vision about Conan.
Yeah, I think that, picking Conan to be David Letterman's successor, this tall, skinny guy who's never been on the air, that dovetails with this idea of, the writers are the real brain trust. The writers are the gold in the show. And
They are.
No,
they are.
Yeah.
They
But,
absolutely are.
but-
They're everything.
and he saw that, and he also thinks that the silliness that goes on in the writer's room, even a good bit of it involves people making fun of Lorne and imitating Lorne, but he recognizes that foolery is the wellspring, that's really where the comedy comes from. And he had always just heard that Conan was cracking everybody up in the writer's room more than anybody else. I also think that because Lorne himself was a sort of a writer / performer as a younger man, that putting Conan in this chair, making him a television star when he was just a writer, there was almost a little bit of road not taken for Lorne,
Mm-hmm.
that he could have gone that way, but he decided not to. In fact, a lot of people don't know, in the first season of SNL, he thought originally that he was going to be the Weekend Update guy. Before he gave that job to Chevy, because he had done something similar. He'd done a news anchor thing on a show in Canada. But then he said that as the weeks before airtime were ticking down, he realized, he said that was a little too Orson Welles, even for me. Because, he thought, I'm going to be in this position of having to cut other people's material so that mine can get on the air.
Yeah.
And he knew that as a manager, that would be a bad look, right?
Yeah, there's actually something also that I loved in the book. Towards the end of the book, you observed a moment with Melissa Villaseñor where Lorne was faced with the decision to cut her piece on Update because he was told that, if they did, there would be room for 2 more sketches. And he said he was intent on giving her shot. And, there's this moment you describe where she comes off having killed and is jumping up and down with, her friends, and Lorne's smiling. And it's like, oh, Dad, it's just, it shows so much of his heart.
Well, yeah, that story, it's interesting. Besides showing his kind of rah-rah, really wanting his people to break through and wanting to give them their chance, just the strange math of the show. Again, it's one of the reasons I wanted to show every day at the show. Yeah. I'm sure that when you're watching at home, nobody knows. So that the dress rehearsal is usually like a half an hour longer than what's on the show. And so then in the 20 minutes between dress and air, Lorne, has this meeting with everybody on the show. They're all smushed in his office, and he's kind of like a general. He's like, cut the first 2 minutes of this, change this, get rid of this wig, we're going to move this is cut, and he completely reorganizes the show. But then, and this is insane that they do this on live television, they start the show at 11:30, and it's still maybe 15 minutes too long. And the idea is they're just going to pair as they go, right? So the show is happening. Lorne's in the control room with several people with stopwatches. And they're like, okay. And they also have to land on the commercial breaks at exactly the right moments. That's why there can't be any improvising, which is something, another thing
That's
people
why
don't
he was
realize.
so mad at Elvis Costello
Right.
when he changed his song, because the show is timed to the second for commercials.
So it's like this big math problem. So I remember sitting there in the control room with him and his deputies, and the way the commercials went with that Melissa thing, they said, well, you could cut her thing, which is just like 2 minutes long. and then that would fit right into a commercial break, and you get 2 whole other sketches on the other side of it. But he so wanted her thing to go that he just sacrificed these. Anyway, it really was amazing. It was like watching somebody. I mean, it's just a big math problem. And Chris Rock said to me, he said, Lorne has been like thousands of people's bosses. And, that might not quite make you a shrink, but it makes you very, very attuned to people's psyches. And I think he is a very good judge of, just what somebody's personality needs. And
what their wounds might be.
Right. Oh, he always said he could tell where they are in the birth order, how they felt about their parents. He's really in there. But, someone like Bill Hader, who is prone to panic attacks, Lorne will come up to him and just say, "What the fuck is the matter with you? Just go out there and do it." But someone like Molly Shannon would describe him kind of just reassuring me with his eyes. He would just know exactly how to treat everybody. How did he get the best performances out of you, Laraine?
Well, I think he kind of left me alone. I was having a lot of trouble getting stuff on the air, and he said, "Well, why don't you just maybe change what it is that you do?" And I was like, "Well, I've spent many years developing that. I don't know how I'd figure out something new." So at the time, I was like, "Oh, I feel like I'm being dropped off a cliff." But it was really, kind of a gesture of faith that he knew that I could figure it out. Yeah. I didn't, but eventually he did. I mean, with Conan, he did that with, Cecily Strong. She did the girl that you'd rather not have a conversation with at a party. And then she wasn't coming up with anything new. And that went on for a long time. And then she just exploded with all these incredible characters and performances. And again, it's like, there are some people that last one season. And of course, invariably, they go on to do something wonderful. But then there are other people that he just hangs in there with.
Right, who he just believes in. So what we were just talking about, Melissa Villaseñor breaking through, and these other characters, that all sort of harkens back to the Chevy thing that I was just talking about. Chevy would sit at the update desk and talk to the audience. And a lot of times, when someone isn't really connecting with the audience, a new person, Lorne can tell that. And so he uses those update characters as a way for people to speak directly to the audience. Mm-hmm. Like Adam Sandler was faltering until he came out and did those things with his guitar about his red hoodie, and then they're like, "Oh, it's that guy, Adam Sandler with a guitar." And so many, I mean, when Bill Murray started in the second season, he had a terrible start. He was like playing like second cop parts and not really getting any laughs. And so Lorne sat down with him and said, "Well, we have to figure out a way to get you through to the audience." So together they wrote this little monologue, and this is also on YouTube. It just cuts on Billy like sitting at a desk, and he just talks to the audience. He goes, "I'm Bill Murray. I'm the new guy. I can tell you don't think I'm funny." And he just unspools this thing about how his dad died, and he wants his dad to be proud of him. But it's really funny, and people paid attention to him. So just that thing, knowing how to, someone he believes in, how to help them connect with the audience, it's really interesting.
Yeah, towards the end of the book, we specifically deal with Saturday. And all that goes into his dance of death, which is, I would describe...
Is that your phrase? That's a good one.
Oh, I wish I could claim it. But I would describe this dance of death of Lorne dealing with the problematic host. And by that, I only mean that they have their agenda and that it might conflict with the show's tone and so many other things that the host couldn't even conceive of. When you read that chapter on Saturday, you see the myriad of things that Lorne, you described the whole thing of him cutting this and all that, but there's so much more to that that's in the book about just understanding that, you can't do this for this reason, or editing something so that it, is almost what they meant, but not too much so that it's a problem. You know, I mean, that's just a talent that you would think that SNL is a well-oiled machine after 50 years, and it is to some extent, but there's nobody who could do that job. Lorne is he is a genius when it comes to all of that.
One of the things that was so interesting about being so up close for all of those 6 days is the first day of the week, Monday, there's a meeting where the host meets the staff and the writers pitch jokes. And really the point of that is just to make the host feel comfortable and welcome and like there's a net. And, you know, as Lorne says...
And they're being listened to.
Yeah, they're being listened to. And sits on a chair and everybody else sits on the floor. You know, one writer said to me that, you know, a lot of people's shrinks at the show say to them, you start your week sitting on the floor? You know, it's a very hierarchical. But so it's all about the host feeling elevated. But as each day ticks by, that kind of changes. And so by Saturday, it's practically like, shut up, Jonah. You know, I mean, but
you know, he
still,
finesses it in such a brilliant way every time.
There's still plenty of decorum, but again, it just shows sort of how you figure out how to get what you need out of the person. And no, Jonah Hill was a kind of a great guinea pig for my week because he had just directed an indie film, and he really wanted to come off like a kind of an auteur, which didn't quite work with a lot of the sketches. And so it was a lot of, I mean, it worked, it was fine in the end, but you could just see all the ego massaging and it was very interesting to watch up close.
Yeah, and it is kind of, you know, survival because he knows that Jonah might be attached to a certain sketch, but at some point he was just saying, it's cut, that's it, it's cut, you know, and he doesn't have to do anything more. Yeah. The Afterparty has also become legend, and I took my kids to see the show. I had never seen it in the audience.
Wow!
And Ed Helms, I think, was the host. The following week was Justin Timberlake and Lady Gaga, but my daughter Hannah wanted to go to prom, so we went the week before. I forgot what I was going to say about this. Oh, hell. The Afterparty. Yeah. I saw that, you know, Lorne was at a table, and I just went over and sat at the table, and everybody was like, what? You want more? You know, I had no idea that it is like being called to court by the monarch.
Right. Well, he sits at a table in the corner, and usually there are a couple of assistants who traditionally have been called lornettes, who go around and kind of bring people for little audiences with him. And, you know, I mean, the host and his pets kind of come and sit, and royalty like Laraine, obviously. But it is a court, you know. And I mean, I don't mean to make him sound kind of like a jerk, but there really are a lot of protocols and hierarchies. I had a thing happen in the middle of this book, working on this book. One of the things that Lorne liked about, I think it was one of the little superstitious things that made him decide to go all in with me and talk to me for this book. So when I was 16, in the first season of SNL, I came to see the show. I lived in Connecticut, and I came to see the show with a few high school friends. And it happened to be an episode that he really liked. Ellie Gould was hosting. It was, you know, it sparked something in him. And I was there at the beginning, I guess you could say, right? So he also was asking me about these kids that I went with. So one time in 2019, I went with some friends to one of the shows. And one of them, I hadn't seen him since like 1979, Eric Klein, a dentist from Milton, Connecticut. And so we're there at the show and we go to the party. And, you know, Lorne's thing is off in the corner. And I'm going to a ladies' room, and I look over, and my friend Eric, the dentist, is sitting right next to Lorne. I was like, oh, my God! You know? But Lorne was really gracious. It was fine. But you understand how that would be. I
totally do. That's hilarious, actually. It's really
Bradley
funny.
Cooper's supposed to be sitting there.
Yeah. Well, I think it's time for questions. Yes, we'll go like around, You, sir.
I have a couple of questions. Hopefully, I don't get called sweaty for these. Susan, was the plan always for the book to take 10 years and have it pegged to the 50th anniversary? That's one question. Second, what has Lorne's reaction been to the book? And third, do you have a favorite SNL skit?
Did everybody hear the questions? Okay.
So, no, it was not the plan. I did not think it was going to take that long. I have a pretty demanding day job as an editor at The New Yorker. I did not get to take that much time off. But, it was a slog, and there were times in the middle of it that I just couldn't believe how long it was taking. But in hindsight, it had to take that long for it to be as kind of fully cooked as it was. And I think it makes sense that it took that long. And, of course, it coming out in the anniversary year ended up being a great bonus prize. And
Yeah. That wasn't...
no, it wasn't planned that way.
Love that.
His reaction, well, Lorne still, he maintains that he hasn't read it yet. He says he's a little bit afraid to read it. But he said he thinks he's going to read it this summer. People like that always say that, so maybe he's read it. I don't know. His brother-in-law told me he thought he'd read it, but his stance is that he hasn't read it yet. Although, very sweetly, he does like to give me a call or text me when various of his fancy friends read it. Like in the last couple of weeks, I've heard that Peyton Manning loved it. I know he's here. We could ask him. Mick loved it. Eric Idle liked it. So, he likes telling me. Candace Bergen just called me. She loved the book. And he also told me, and this is funny that he likes this because he likes his anonymity. People are coming up to him on the street and telling him that they read it and they liked it. So I think he's enjoying it, cementing his place in history, I guess.
Do you have a favorite skit of all time?
There's one that I love that I like to mention because, there's so much Trump stuff now. There's a great sketch that Robert Smigel and Jim Downey wrote during the Reagan administration called Master Brain. And Phil Hartman plays Reagan in it. And you know it, right? And the premise is that Reagan is actually this knife-sharp, brilliant intellect. And he only pretends to be the kind of bumbling goofball, when he's in public. And so it's a cabinet meeting where he's like doing these calculus sums in his head and figuring out, shipments of oil to Venezuela or like whatever. And then some Girl Scouts come in and he reverts to the... Anyway, it's really brilliant. That's the one I would say.
So first of all, it's a fantastic session. I'm really, really happy I came to it. I wanted to ask you what you thought would happen to SNL when there's no more Lorne, which must be, and then also why is it not available on Kindle?
Oh, I don't know the answer to that, but
it's eventual, I think.
Oh, the book?
Yeah.
Oh, of course it is. It's not.
Not in the UK, maybe.
Oh, no, it is here. It is here, and you can get an Audible. I know that there.
Who's
I know
reading it on Audible?
I can't remember her name. I tried it. Sarah Silverman was going to do it, and then the scheduling didn't work out. But it's on Audible. It is on.
In the UK?
There isn't a publisher in the UK right now. We'll figure out how to get you one. But wait, what was the other question?
The SNL.
Oh, yeah, just very quickly. There have been names floated, but I don't really see I don't see it being Tina Fey or Seth Meyers or. I have a theory, and I hope NBC listens to me here because, there are 2 times a week, 2 periods of a few hours. One, which is Wednesday at the read-through when all 40 sketches are read, and one is Saturday, the dress rehearsal, and then right after when Lorne does his jiu-jitsu with the show. Those are the times when he's absolutely necessary because it's all about his taste and his gut. And I think, he takes very good care of himself. He's very healthy. I think he could be doing, if he just wanted to come in 2 days a week for those hour periods, that he could do it for the next 10 years or so. And he has a really able team of deputies. And another thing I loved in the book was being able to give these people some credit. Bring them out from the shadows. There are 4 of them. And they've really internalized a lot of his basic taste. I think it's sort of what happened during the first COVID show. He was locked down in St. Bart's, he wouldn't do Zoom, and his people did it with him checking in and looking at tapes. So that's what I think should happen. I don't know. NBC can pay me a consulting fee for that if they want to.
So many people have also asked me and other castmates that I've talked to, do you think Lorne will retire? And all of us are saying, no, he is never going to retire. This is his life, and nobody does it better.
He's never missed a single show. I mean, if you think about that, all these years, no stomach flu, or, he's always been there.
Sounds amazing.
Yes.
So many questions. I don't know what to ask first, but the universality of the program. So I remember watching that first season. Thank you, Laraine. Hysterical. After that, we'd all come home Saturday nights. We had to be there to watch it. 50 years later, my friends and I are still watching it. We're not cool. You said he looks for the cool, but yeah, we still enjoy it. So what is it that it's the success and that it can appeal to such a broad range of people?
Well, I think that the format ended up being so durable. He often compares it to a Snickers bar. He says, it's about managing expectations, like another management principle. It's like a Snickers bar. There's a certain amount of chocolate, a certain amount of peanuts, a certain amount of caramel. People know what to expect. And also, it's like the Dow or the Yankees. It's going to have good years and bad years, but the basic format is pretty durable. And he, styles and humor change. He's aware of that. That is one of the things he learned doing cruddy TV in Hollywood in the 60s and 70s. Is you'd have Dean Martin and the Rolling Stones on the same show, and so he's aware of when things, when cultural collisions happen. And I think he's been very smart at, in the same way he identifies talent on the show, he identifies great talent in the other, the talent bookers and the young producers that he grooms. And he finds very smart people, and then he truly delegates to them. Delegating. I've been in these meetings with him where he's talking to these 25-year-old music bookers, and they'll tell him who the new cool people are, and then he'll have just the right questions about, well, can they hold this room, this Studio 8H, and the people at home on television, and what, he knows how to figure out whether they'll actually play on that scale, but he leaves it to these other people or his children, to tell him what is cool, because at 80 he doesn't really know,
One more question.
Okay.
Does anybody have it?
Yeah,
Yes.
I'm just curious about the movie Saturday Night that Jason Reitman just did.
Poppycock. No.
Your kind of assessment of how he was portrayed in that movie versus your book, and kind of and what your thoughts were about it.
Well, Laraine, you talk about that. We talked about it a little bit. And then
Well, it is a work of pure fiction, but I thought that the actor and the writing portrayed Lorne very accurately, in the sense that he appeared unflappable. Despite all the pressure he was under, he appeared to be handling it very well, and he did. But at that time, I don't really think he had the foundation for it, but he had the instinct. What do you think?
Yeah, I think, he always wore, and you see this in the movie, he always wore this pin from the 40s, this mother duck pin with, and Candice Bergen said to me, I always thought that pin was about how on the surface Lorne looks completely calm, but like a duck, his feet are furiously paddling under the surface. And the movie shows him a little bit that way. He's keeping it together, but he's, his heart must be thumping. And a number of people said that he broke out in, horrible acne that week. He must have been super stressed. I mean, I thought, for me, watching that movie was like watching an Oliver Stone movie. It was so fictionalized, but like 5 years worth of incidents were crammed into that 1 hour. But it did kind of, it did capture the basic flavor. And I liked the fact that all those cool Gen Z actors in the movie probably introduced the show to a new generation of viewers. One thing I told Laraine an hour ago, funny reaction, I asked some of the current writers what they thought about it, and they were very dismissive and territorial, really, and they said, it's just kind of like watching somebody like fuck up your song in a karaoke bar. They just didn't they just felt turf conscious about it.
All right, I guess
we
that's,
have to. I guess we have to
do we
stop.
have one burning desire?
Very quickly. I was listening to a podcast, actually, the Dana Carvey ride-along.
That's a great one.
They were talking about SNL coming to the UK, and I was curious if that's happening and if Lorne is involved.
No, it is happening. He's executive producing it, and he's going to be
Sky
very
T-
involved.
I
And
think, right?
something I didn't know until I worked on this book is that they licensed the show to a lot of other countries. There's a very successful one in South Korea. There's one in China that is politics free, and they just license it. They're not involved in it. But one little funny story about this: they licensed it to Italy, and the Italians sent them the first episode to take a look at, and it's like this topless woman running around in the cold open, and so the Broadway video people said, well, that's not the kind of thing we would do. That's not really our brand. And so the Italians just said, like, what? You do not find her beautiful?
Love that.
Anyway.
All right, everybody. Thank you so
Thank
much
you.
for coming.
Thank you, Laraine.